All right, excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me today. My talk is a little bit different. I've been attending several of the sessions. So I am a clinical associate professor or assistant professor. Um, and so my work does not involve research at all. However, I have done this particular survey with a cohort of people, and it is primarily focused on program and curriculum development. And the findings, one of the areas that I really wanted to focus on for that survey was looking at technology skill sets. So that is really the main focus. And it's really only one question that we asked, but it was a multi-part question. So that's why I'm here today, to kind of share the results from that. My presentation is probably also a little bit more interactive, because I would love to kind of hear sort of your responses to sort of what, okay, y'all are in presenter mode. Okay, thank you for whoever shared that with me. I don't know why. Let me try to share screen one more time with something that way you can see it in a better way. Hopefully that is better. All right, I'll keep moving on. So kind of with that said in mind, let's get started. So the name of my talk, of course, is Uncoding the Layers of Technological Awareness and Skills Our Workforce Needs. So these are just some objectives I'd like to touch on today. I'm, of course, from the University of Illinois. I have she, her pronouns, and I'm from the School of Social Work. So most of the work that I'm going to present to you today is from a social work perspective, but of course, that we had 197 respondents from this survey, and they vary quite dramatically across the board of sort of what their roles are in social services in general. I hope to sort of have you do some thinking on sort of what you consider to be some of those personal rankings of the skills I'm going to talk about today. And then, of course, I want to talk briefly, if we have time, about ethical and racial and cultural implications of tech. And then at the end, I'll kind of summarize some of my thoughts around what are the next steps and sort of those conclusions. All right, I also want to do a quick plug here. As part of my work, I primarily work in our field department, and I do internship placements. So I teach a course on a pre-seminar as well as for the seminar when the students are in their internships. And our internships are about 27 hours a week, 400 hours over the period of time. And then in the past year, I developed and I'm teaching a technology and human rights class. So that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from. I also am involved in this fellowship, which is called the Social Work Health Futures Lab. And it's funded by Robert Wood Johnson and Portland State and the Institute for the Future. And so this is kind of a space where I'm very actively involved of sort of helping the field of social work really consider the technology skills as well as the implications around technology. And what are those pieces around curriculum development that we really need to be focused on? So I'll kind of tie that in together at the end a little bit. So to frame my talk today, I wanted to quickly sort of share what we have, of course, a code of ethics, which I'm sure many of you who know anything about social work know that's a really strong aspect of our profession and our identity as social workers. And so for me, this kind of lays some foundational work around how the code of ethics really kind of lacks in certain ways around how we help social workers navigate technology. And so I can only imagine for other fields in social services, if they don't necessarily, if we as sort of like this long-standing professional entity haven't really mapped out well how we use technology and the aspects that we need to be considering around technology, then my guess is many other service providers or professionals who are working in any sort of social services probably also do not have these either. So the definition here, of course, is very broad in our code of ethics, and it talks about technology-assisted social worker services, and they kind of list out, of course, different types of technologies. But I really like that last little bullet point that I have highlighted, that it talks about emerging digital applications. And that, of course, is constantly changing. And our code of ethics wants us to be aware of all of these technological developments, but once again, we just tell a lot of our professionals in the field what not to do and necessarily what to do. And so that's kind of where my questions came up around the survey. So back in January to April 2020, right before and or during when the pandemic hit, we did a career readiness survey. And the aim of the survey was to gather information from stakeholders as to what the critical skills and knowledges they thought were necessary for our students, both at the bachelor's level and the master's level. What were those essential skills as they enter into their careers? So the results were used to inform decisions made about curriculum and development of both levels of our program. We were really fortunate. We have a wonderful partnership with our many different aspects of our former and or current field instructors. We have an amazing sort of service learning partners that we work with that are all different sectors. They're not necessarily just social workers. They're doing all different works in, economic development and local government and you name it. So we had a great response rate throughout that time period. And so to build the survey, we actually looked at, if anyone has ever heard of NACE, I have a slide on here in just a second. But NACE is, they are the National Association of Colleges and Employers. So I'm going to give this kind of perspective and I'll jump back to the other slide. So we had them rank the NACE skills, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And we asked them to rank it based on if they felt like upcoming graduates needed to have a proficient skill in these sort of areas, needed to have exposure and or working knowledge of a particular skill, and or this skill can be taught to new professionals once they've entered the workforce. And we ask them, while useful, is this skill not necessary to enter the workforce? So we use a lot of the NACE for most of the section of the survey. Unfortunately, I do not have IRB approval to talk about the other parts of the survey because I wasn't really part of that aspect of it. So I'm going to talk more about the technology side, but I wanted the technology question that I did put into the survey, but I wanted to kind of share some background too about what we were asking more broadly about that readiness piece. So this here is sort of it's a snapshot from NACE and sort of what they consider to be those critical skills that any across the board, all professions, that any recent graduates should have to prepare for career readiness. So as you can see, of course, critical thinking was very high. But if you look down, digital technology is pretty low. And so that's kind of what caught my eyes. We started to think about the survey and what questions we wanted to ask and what we were hoping for the implications would be for our program. And so for me, I'm like, wow, I mean, of course, all of these are very important skills, but the fact that today's age, digital technology is still pretty low was kind of what made me really think about how we can ask our partners where they specifically rank technology skills. So I developed one question out of this 10 question survey that we asked, and we kept it really brief intentionally, hoping to get people to respond to it. And so my question I propose, and of course, like I'm sure don't do research, but I'm sure like many of you, when you do write questions, you look back on it, you're like, oh, I know so much more, and I know how I could have written that a little bit better. But so my main focus of the rest of my talk today is thinking about what is sort of the career readiness piece around technology. So these are the questions sort of the options I gave them. I apologize. I think I have the question on the next slide. But so this was the question I proposed. In your opinion, what is the most important technological skill that new social work graduates need to possess in order to succeed in their career? So I'm going to flip back really quickly. And so this was kind of the different categories of questions that we asked them. Is your understanding of ethical use of technology in social work practice, understanding of information management, their understanding of the ability to adapt to emerging technologies. And I kind of gave them some examples of that. I asked them more specifically about social media literacy, but I think now I would open that up more broadly around new media literacy. And then of course I wanted to know about their understanding of equity and inclusion. And I did throw in that all of the above, which now I really feel like I wish I wouldn't have. So I just checked the time, so I know I'm at 1:45. I don't want to keep anybody too much longer, but just really quickly, I thought I would just ask you, if you want to share in the box, you're welcome to, but what you feel like are some of the important skill sets that any of your students might have or need at this point. You're welcome to share in the chat, but I'm going to keep moving. Same here. I was just opening up space to kind of talk about why you felt like that might have been the important pieces. Thank you for anyone who's chatting. Definitely see. Thank you so much, Keely. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to think about there in terms of why people feel that way. So let's go back and look at that really quick. So the understanding ability to adapt to emerging technologies, absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that's I always tell my students that they'll be practicing until the year 2080, give or take, and so it's like, oh, so much is going to change in that time, especially around emerging technology. Okay, so to kind of the other pieces, I'll let you kind of see the findings, which I'm sure is what you're really interested in. So this is what our respondents of our 197 respondents shared with us. And of course, 36% felt like all of the above. Social work students should be able to, encapsulate all of these skills. And I think, for me, being very realistic, what can we actually do, and where do we focus our curriculum development? And so I was really, really, of course, pleased to see that the ethical use of technology was the next up. But the question is what does that actually look like? And so there's many aspects around ethical use of technology we could focus on. But for today's talk, I'm going to kind of really actually finish up with the equity and inclusion in tech, which is the piece for me that I really focus on in my technology class. And I was also quite alarmed to see that this number was really low. And I think once again, because people are in most social services, we don't even have the basic skills, let alone the understanding of how the technology we are using, and that could be database collection, that could be transparency in data. People aren't really thinking about sort of how do we ensure there is equity and inclusion in that data. And so that's kind of a piece for me that I'm really focused on. So these are just sort of questions I have for myself and that I'm thinking about around the code of ethics, because we don't really fully explain ethical use of technology very well in our code of ethics. We actually even have an entire standard for technology, and once again, it's very, very limited. It's very specific in some ways and not broad enough in other ways. So all right, so this is the technology standards that we do have, and they have come along. We went from like basically saying that we don't want to have practitioners necessarily using technology unless they have to now talking about how technology can cause harms. So we've come a long way, yay us, but lots to think about. So kind of the pieces, I think I'll just jump ahead. I think the pieces that I wanted to kind of think about is the skill sets that we took away from that survey that we want to develop. And for me, the questions are, is it unreasonable for new graduates to have all of these technology skills? And if not, which ones do we focus on? And I already mentioned kind of the alarm I feel for us not understanding sort of tech racism. And I think the other piece for me is, when I think more broadly about the audience today, is for social science education programs. Like, how do we assess what technology curriculums are currently being embedded? And what are sort of the need for more clearly developed guidance for, the future, for the beyond today, because we're not even really meeting the needs today, but like, how do we move, train them for what we need to do year 2030, 2040? And then, of course, what are sort of the advocacy skills that we can just teach them today around technology? And that's something we, of course, most of our programs all teach about advocacy skills in different ways. And so these are just some of the things that I think are important to teach our students how to ask about how certain products that we might be using, technology products, how are they developed? How, like asking about data sets, students don't know how to ask those questions. What are the ethical practices for accountability for those technologies, both the developers and for us as users and practitioners with that technology? Who controls the data? How the funders use the data, I think, is another really big piece when we think about technology. And then the last sort of pieces is, how do we make the data we do use more transparent, and then allow our clients and our other partners have more control over the data, depending on sort of their role in our work. And then just some more practical pieces I'm sort of thinking about are around like ethics committees and tech ethics committees that should exist in all of our professions in social sciences. So, all right, and those are just some other resources, not necessarily stuff I use for my talk today, but just places to recommend for people to learn more and think more about those things. So, all right, I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much.